So there used to be these things called cassettes. First, there were cassettes, right? Cassette tapes. That was how you purchased and listened to music. And then there were CDs. And then there was Napster, which was a website. Today we're talking about the fourth meditation by Rene Descartes. Of course, you should take a look at my lecture videos about meditations 1, 2, and 3, but here's a quick recap. The first thing that we get in meditation 1 is we get the plan for all 6 meditations. The plan is Descartes wants to know what he can know for certain, so he's going to stop believing anything that he can doubt, anything that's not 100% guaranteed to be true, and then he's going to try to start building up all of his beliefs, only believing things that he knows for certain. So the first meditation is where he wipes the slate clean. He doubts all of these basic principles that underlie all of his beliefs, and then at the end of meditation 1, he's doubted everything. He's doubted all of his beliefs. He's doubted his belief that he has hands, that the earth exists. He's doubted mathematical beliefs, everything. At the beginning of meditation 2, Descartes finds one claim that he thinks he knows for sure must be true. And that claim is that he exists, because Descartes thinks he needs to exist in order to be going through this mental process, in order to doubt all of his beliefs, that sort of thing. But at that stage, at the end of meditation 2, Descartes only knows that he exists and that he's a mind that can do the doubting. Then in meditation 3, Descartes thinks he's found something outside of his own mind that he knows for certain exists, and that, he thinks, is God. So Descartes offers in meditation 3 this sort of rather involved and weird proof of the existence of God. What we get now in meditation 4 is we get sort of like a deviation from the progress of the meditations, right? So far it's been like wipe everything clean and then build back up our system of beliefs. But in meditation 4, Descartes sort of pauses to note a potential problem with the last belief that he just resurrected, as it were. Now, to really understand what's going on here, you're going to need to understand the distinction between arguments and the conclusions of arguments. That is, it's sort of the same distinction between a claim and an argument in favor of that claim. Now, I have another video about that distinction, and I think the video is called something like, the difference between arguments and conclusions, explained with an example about flat Earth or whatever. That's the name of the video. I'll put a link to it in the description. What ended up happening with this video is that I posted it on the internet, and then all of these flat earthers watched the video because the example that I just happened to use to explain the difference between arguments and conclusions happened to do with flat earth stuff. And so all these flat earthers showed up on the video, and they were like, he's assuming that we're using this theory of gravity or whatever. And so things got pretty heated in that video, in the comments anyway. That's relevant just because Descartes is, in meditation 4, dealing with a problem to the conclusion that he arrived at in meditation 3, and that conclusion was that God exists. But what you have to keep in mind is that Descartes is attacking in meditation 4, or he's considering an attack and then responding to that attack. He's considering an attack on this claim, the claim that God exists. He's not attacking his own argument in favor of that claim, right? There might be problems with the argument. Indeed, if this claim is false, then there must be some problem with the argument. But what we're dealing with in meditation 4, and this is important, is just an attack on this claim, this conclusion, the conclusion that God exists. So let's jump right into it. On page AT53, we get a statement. This happens over the course of 2.5 paragraphs, and so we'll go through all 2.5 paragraphs. A statement of the problem, the apparent problem with this conclusion. To begin with, I recognize that it is impossible that God should ever deceive me. For in every case of trickery or deception, some imperfection is to be found. And although the ability to deceive appears to be an indication of cleverness or power, the will to deceive is undoubtedly evidence of malice or weakness, and so cannot apply to God. Okay, let's stop there. So Descartes' point there is just God is not the kind of creature, if God exists, God is just not the kind of creature that would deceive anyone or anything about anything. God doesn't trick people, not because trickery isn't a thing that God should be able to do. Yeah, if God is all powerful, then God should be able to fool anyone. But if God is all good, then God would never want to fool anyone. So God doesn't deceive. That's the first point. And then in the very next paragraph, we get the next point, the next sort of step that Descartes needs to take in presenting a problem for this claim. Next, I know by experience that there is in me a faculty of judgment, which, like everything else which is in me, I certainly received from God. And since God does not wish to deceive me, he surely did not give me the kind of faculty which would ever enable me to go wrong while using it correctly. Descartes just sort of extends the idea that God is not a deceiver to the claim that my mind, this is Descartes, thinking about himself, my mind can't be the sort of thing that tends to make mistakes because God gave me my mind. So just as God wouldn't trick me, God wouldn't give me a mind that would lead me to make mistakes, at least not as long as I'm using that mind properly. Then we get the problem. Right after that, in the very next sentence or two, at the beginning of the next paragraph, we get Descartes' statement of the problem. There would be no further doubt on this issue were it not that what I have just said appears to imply that I am incapable of ever going wrong. For if everything that is in me comes from God, and he did not endow me with a faculty for making mistakes, it appears that I can never go wrong. And certainly, so long as I think only of God and turn my whole attention to him, I can find no cause of error or falsity. But when I turn back to myself, I know by experience that I am prone to countless errors. Okay, so right there, Descartes just says, but I do make mistakes. It seems impossible that Descartes could make mistakes. If God exists and created Descartes, gave Descartes his mind, then God wouldn't give him the kind of mind that would lead him to make mistakes. But he does make mistakes. And so the conclusion is, well, God must not exist. So that's the problem. What Descartes is going to do in the rest of Meditation 4 is he's going to attempt to solve that problem. Descartes thinks that God exists, and he thinks that this is just merely an apparent problem, but he thinks it's serious enough to, be worth pausing sort of the main thread of the meditations in order to deal with this potential problem, or this problem that some people might think has arisen. Before we get on to Descartes' response to the problem, it's worth just saying that this problem, we'll call it the problem of error. This problem is analogous to a much more famous problem in the philosophy of religion called the problem of evil. Okay, so very, very quickly, the problem of evil, which Descartes doesn't talk about, is just that evil things happen in the world. Terrible, terrible, awful things happen in the world. Well, if God exists and God knows about all the things in the world, has the power to stop all those things if God wishes to, and God is benevolent, if God is also good, then God would want to stop all the bad things, so there would never be any bad things. But there are bad things, so it must be that a God like that doesn't exist. That's the problem of evil. It's a very famous problem, and there's lots of philosophical work done discussing whether or not that problem really does demonstrate that God doesn't exist. The problem of error is analogous. The same sort of things apply. If God is all-knowing, then God knows about all of the mistakes that Descartes would make. If God is all-powerful, then God could rearrange things so that Descartes doesn't make any mistakes. And if God is all-good, then God doesn't want Descartes to make mistakes, and so Descartes would never make mistakes. But he does, so God must not exist. Very analogous problem, and all of the solutions that Descartes is going to consider are going to be analogous to solutions that have in the history of philosophy been proposed to solve the problem of evil. Okay, that was just a side note about the problem of evil. If you take a philosophy of religion course, then you'll no doubt spend a lot of time on that. Okay, so after introducing the problem on page AT53, AT54, Descartes spends the next couple of pages, AT54, AT55, he spends those pages discussing potential solutions to the problem of error, but they're solutions that don't really satisfy him. Like, one solution he considers is, well, Descartes is not infinite, but Descartes is also not nothing. So Descartes is sort of in between, so of course he won't be perfect because he's not as perfect as God. But Descartes thinks, well, that doesn't work, that doesn't solve the problem, because God could have created a sort of medium-level creature like Descartes, but one that doesn't make mistakes. It would still be, not as good as God, but not nothing. He's not satisfied with that answer. He then also considers the somewhat well-known response to the problem of evil. He considers the thought that, well, look, I'm not God. I don't have an infinite mind, so I don't understand stuff. I don't understand God's ways or whatever. I'm just a dummy. There's some solution to this problem. I just don't know what it is. Descartes considers that, and he doesn't outright reject it, but he seems clearly unsatisfied with it, because that does seem like an unsatisfying response. He seems unsatisfied with it because he doesn't, use it. He goes on to give a different response to this problem, and that's the one that he relies on. So what Descartes has to do in order to solve this problem is he has to explain how error is possible in a world where an all-perfect God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God exists. So he has to have some explanation of where error comes from. And he has an explanation like that, and it's a little bit complicated. And we're going to read the passage on page AT56 where he tells that story, where he explains where he thinks error, mistaken beliefs, come from. Next, when I look more closely at myself and inquire into the nature of my errors, for these are the only evidence of some imperfection in me, I notice that they depend on two concurrent causes. Okay, let's pause there. So we know already, we're not even through the first sentence here. We know that Descartes is going to explain his errors in terms of two things. There's two causes that concur, that happen at the same time. They work together to make errors happen. So there's going to be two things. So before we even keep reading, we want to know that there's two things coming, and we want to note what those two things are. Okay, so here are two spots on the board, right? And we're going to put in the two things that we know are coming. They're going to explain error. This, by the way, is how you have to read all philosophy. That is, you have to stop halfway through every sentence and think, okay, what did that already just say, and what's coming right now? Because the material is dense enough that if you're not reading in this very active way, it's just going to be very hard to understand what's going on. So let's start this selection from AT56 again. This is where we get the explanation of how error happens. Next, when I look more closely at myself and inquire into the nature of my errors, for these are the only evidence of some imperfection in me, I notice that they... Wait, who are they? We haven't even gotten back to these two causes of error, but who are they? Who is Descartes talking about when he says they? Next, when I look more closely at myself and inquire into the nature of my errors, for these are the only evidence of some imperfection in me, I notice that they, my errors, they depend on two concurrent causes. Okay, here we go. Namely, on the faculty of knowledge, which is in me. Okay, that's the first cause of error, the faculty of knowledge. Good, let's keep going. And on the faculty of choice, or freedom of the will. Okay, that's the second cause, the faculty of choice or freedom of the will. That is, they depend on both the intellect and the will simultaneously. Oh, whoa, Oh, so we got another name for this one. Okay, so this is the faculty of knowledge or intellect. And this is the faculty of choice or will. I'll just add that Descartes not only has multiple names in just this one sentence, he has multiple names for this faculty and multiple names for this faculty. There's another name that he uses for this one, which is, he calls it the understanding. So I should say something about what a faculty is. By faculty, Descartes just means a portion of the mind, or like a component of his mind. So he thinks his mind has got two components, or two parts. There's the understanding, knowledge, intellect part, and then there's the choice or will part. Let me try to explain this with an analogy. I'm old enough to remember being in my late teens, and there was this new thing that became available, and it was called an iPod. So there used to be these things called cassettes. First, there were cassettes, right? Cassette tapes. That was how you purchased and listened to music. And then there were CDs. And then there was Napster, which was a website that would allow you to illegally download music from another person. And then you would burn that music onto a CD in either a WAV file or an MP3 file. But it needed to be a WAV file if you were using some CD players, but they were much more cumbersome files. You could only fit like 10 songs on a CD or whatever. Anyway, then in like, I guess the early 2000s or something, there was this thing from Apple called an iPod. An iPod was like a brick. It was like big and heavy. It was thick. And it looks sort of like what a smartphone looks like now. And anyway, all that it did was it just stored music files, and you could listen to the music files, but you could fit like hundreds of them, many of which you still had from when you were downloading them illegally through Napster, but then Napster was gone by the time this happened, I think. Anyway, you'd have an iPod. An iPod had a limited amount of memory, even if it could fit, way more songs than a CD could, or a tape cassette. You had an iPod, and it had some songs on it, or you downloaded some songs and then put them on the iPod. That's what the faculty of knowledge or intellect is like. So really, I should have written this on the other side of the board. Anyway, the faculty of knowledge or intellect is just sort of like, for Descartes, it's a repository of ideas. You experience things in the world, or maybe you don't. Maybe the ideas don't come from the world. Maybe they're just given to you. But the point is, you've got all of these ideas. And they just sit in your knowledge or intellect or understanding, like on the memory banks of your iPod. Now, the crucial thing to note is this. Just like an iPod, the faculty of knowledge or intellect, it can only contain so much, and it only has so many ideas in it. But the fact that it's finite in that sense, that it only has certain ideas that have been loaded onto it, that fact doesn't mean that it's faulty or bad. Just like if I give you an iPod back in 2002, if I give you an iPod, you can't come back and say like, hey, this doesn't have literally every song ever recorded on it. Yeah, of course it doesn't. But it has like hundreds of songs, and iPods are the kinds of things that hold hundreds, but not all songs. So I haven't given you a defective iPod if I give you an iPod with just some songs on it. So too, God hasn't given Descartes a defective faculty of knowledge if this faculty only has some ideas in it. So we've got the faculty of knowledge. It is just a repository of ideas, and it's perfectly good. It's not defective, but it only has some ideas in it. Then, by contrast, there's the faculty of choice or will. Descartes thinks that the faculty of will is the kind of thing that you've either got it or you don't. It's not like, an iPod or a faculty of knowledge, which could get bigger or smaller, could contain more or fewer things. You could get a more expansive one. You could get an iPod that's, I don't know, back in the day it was probably like, 100 megabytes or like 200 megabytes. Those were the size amounts, whatever it was, right? It wasn't like today where there's like terabytes and stuff. Okay. Unlike that, where there's different size faculties of knowledge or different size iPods, the faculty of will, you either have it or you don't. It's the faculty that allows you to choose what to do and to choose what, and this is important, what to believe. If you have a faculty of will, Descartes thinks, then you're the kind of thing that can decide what to think based on the knowledge that you've accrued. So what we have at this point is two faculties, two parts of the mind, Descartes thinks, and each one of them is working properly. He was given non-defective, properly working faculties. He was given a faculty of knowledge, that's sort of like an iPod, and then he was given a faculty of the will, which, like, I don't know, I don't have an analogy in the iPod metaphor for that, but whatever. We're given two perfectly good faculties, Descartes thinks. Mistake happens when we misuse these two faculties in combination with one another. It's like if you had an iPod and a set of headphones. There used to be these things called headphones, and they had a wire on them, and then you would stick them into the iPod or your phone or whatever, or your Discman, your CD player, or your Walkman, your cassette player, right? You'd stick the wire that comes out of the headphones into the music player, and then you'd hear the sound in the headphones. You could get a perfectly good iPod and a perfectly good set of headphones, and you just don't know how to use them. You just don't know how to plug them in. If that's the case, you weren't given faulty equipment. You just don't know how to use the equipment in combination. That's what Descartes thinks happens when he makes an error. He was given a perfectly good faculty of knowledge, a perfectly good repository of ideas or understanding. And then he was given a perfectly good faculty of will that allows him to choose what to believe and what not to believe. The mistake is that he combines them in a way that causes him to error. This happens on AT58, page AT58. A mistake is when he chooses to believe something that goes beyond the limits of his understanding. There's all the stuff that he understands. That's the domain of the things that he understands. But he can choose to use his mind, his will, to believe something that he doesn't really understand. When he does that, that's what allows him to error. And the crucial thing is, when he errors in that way, it's his fault. It's not that God gave him some faulty equipment, because if God had given him some faulty equipment, then God wouldn't be a perfect being, and then God wouldn't be God. There would be no all-perfect God. But if God gives him a perfectly good iPod and a perfectly good whatever is analogous to the faculty of the will in the iPod analogy, I guess the headphones, but whatever. If God gave him perfectly good equipment, a perfectly good faculty of knowledge and a perfectly good faculty of choice, and then he makes a mistake with it, then that doesn't show that God is imperfect. That's Descartes' solution to the problem of error. Then, on page AT59, Descartes draws a sort of conclusion from this solution for how he's going to need to proceed in Meditations 5 and 6. Here's what he says. If, however, I simply refrain from making a judgment in cases where I do not perceive the truth with sufficient clarity and distinctness, then it is clear that I am behaving correctly and avoiding error. But if in such cases I either affirm or deny, then I am not using my free will correctly. Descartes thinks, look, there's the matters that he knows with clarity and distinctness. These are technical terms for Descartes, and we don't need to get into the weeds too much about exactly what he means by them, but basically the point is that there's some things that Descartes understands very well. He understands them very well. This understanding, this knowledge was given to him directly from God. Those are the things he can trust. The clear and distinct ideas, or the clear and distinct perceptions. And he resolves, going forward, that he's not going to believe anything that he doesn't know with clarity and distinctness. If he doesn't know it with clarity and distinctness, then he's not going to believe it, and then he's going to be able to avoid making mistakes. Okay, so that's meditation 4. Primarily, it is a solution, or an attempted solution, to an apparent problem that arises based on the conclusion that he reached in meditation 3. In meditation 5, here's what happens next. In Meditation 5, Descartes gives another proof for the existence of God. This is a more famous type of proof. It's called the ontological proof. We're going to get onto that when we read Meditation 5. Then in Meditation 6, Descartes is going to sort of do his big finale. He's going to then prove from his own existence and the existence and nature of God, he's going to use those to prove, he thinks, that almost all of the big important beliefs that he started with, the ones that he wiped away in Meditation 1, they're guaranteed to be true as well. So he gets to believe that he has a physical body, and most of the things around him are roughly as they appear to be.